Hey everyone, Liam here. Welcome to this week's YouTube video. This week we're going to be painting the Necron blades that you can see on screen at the moment. As always, I hope you find it helpful. If you do enjoy the video, please hit the like button. It means a huge amount to the growth of the channel. And if you want to see more, naturally hit that subscribe button. But regardless, thank you very much for watching, and here we go. First up, what we're going to do is we're going to thin down our paint ready for the airbrush. In this case, I'm using equal parts water to equal parts Vallejo Flow Improver and equal parts paint. In this case, I'm using Games Workshop paints. So Citadel on the left, Night Lord's blue, in the center is Caliban Green, and on the right is Phoenician Purple. These are all Games Workshop paints, but you don't have to use them, whatever works for you. Feel free to mix up the recipes, you'll get some really cool results. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to lay down the darkest color. Now, because we're going over a black base coat, this is going to give us a very dark foundation. You could base coat the whole of the blade this color if you want. I like to try and leave some of the black, is the only thing though. Purely because we're going to end up overspraying a little bit onto other areas of the blade anyway. So I like to try and retain as much of that dark color as I can get. Next up, what we're doing is placing in the midtones for the blades. So the colors that we're going to be using on that, on the left hand side with the blue is P3 Cygnus blue highlight. In the center is Games Workshop Moot Green, and on the right is just a little bit of Vallejo game color white added into the Phoenician Purple. So the purple recipe is you're just adding consecutive amounts of white. Now, the idea with this is where we need to start being a little bit more careful, and we need to be very aware of the angle in which we're spraying. So you can see that my airbrush is almost like at a 45-degree angle to this blade, and I'm trying very gently to spray chunks of this Moot Green and leave the Caliban Green in between. So I'm not too bothered about the overspray. I'm not too bothered about being really precise here. What I'm doing is I'm trying to get a nice gradient from that Caliban Green to the Moot Green. Remember, our paint consistency is really important. If you're getting speckling, it means that, so like splatters of paint, it means that your paint could be too thick, so you need more water. It could also mean that a little bit more flow improver might help, but it could also mean that your compressor is not actually pushing enough air through. If your air pressure is too low, it might not actually blast enough paint through, and you're getting dry tip very quickly. That can also be an issue. Now also, when we're talking about the flat of the blade, again, look at the angle that I'm spraying this airbrush at. I'm trying to only catch one side by making sure my airbrush is nearly running parallel with the actual flat of the blade itself. Now, for anyone who wants to know, because I know anyone's going to ask, I run my compressor around 30-35 psi, and then I limit that air pressure with the trigger of the airbrush. Now, really important thing is when you put the paint into the airbrush, make sure you cover the end, clean the needle with the kitchen roll, and then just blast some of the paint back up through the cup, and then that will mix what's in the tunnel of the airbrush. So this is also really helpful. It can stop you getting big blasts of chunks of paint that are stashed in the tunnel of the airbrush. And it also cleans off the dry tip. Dry tip is a big deal when you're airbrushing. Basically, it's where you get a buildup of paint where it's dried. And then when you start airbrushing, when you start spraying with dry tip, it will blast all of that dry paint all over your model, and again, give you a splattered result. Now remember, with airbrushing, it's very much a finesse tool. Yes, it's quicker than doing it with a brush as a general rule. You still need to be very gentle, and you need to take your time with it. So build up these transitions very lightly and slowly. Now what you'll probably find is it will start feeling almost washed out, like the paint will flow into it will automatically go into the recesses, and we're going to lose a lot of vibrancy as we go. Don't panic about that. We can fix that later. That'll come. Next up, I'm using pure Vallejo Game Air Dead White. So this is a pure white. Now, if you're up for it, the best white that I found for an airbrush is Tamiya white, but you need, because it's alcohol based, you need a special thinner, which is called XT20A, I believe. If you're up for doing that, it's alcohol based, so be a little bit more careful. that will help when it comes to airbrushing white. But in this case, this is Vallejo Game Air White because I want to keep the tutorial based around acrylic paints, around like GW paints and Vallejo, the more regular ones. And the idea of what I'm doing is within those areas of green or bright blue or bright purple, I'm now pushing those areas all the way up to pure white. Now, you don't necessarily need to do it this way. You could go less bright, but what's happening as I'm doing this is I'm losing a lot of the saturation and vibrancy in my color. So I know that I'm going to have to bring that back later on. So I'm going really, really extreme with this bright highlight because I know that I'm going to have to do some work over the top of this later on. So if you don't want to go this extreme and you want to just use like a really bright blue or a really bright green or a really bright purple, then by all means go for it. But I'm trying to compensate for the fact that these are looking a little bit pastel-y, like there's not a lot of saturation in it. So again, if you're struggling with the white here, go over the tips that I already said with Flow Improver, how thin your paint is, the dry tip, and your actual pressure from your air compressor. But if you really are struggling, as I said, Tamiya White, in my opinion, in my experience, is the best one that you can use. Now, I talked about overspray earlier and losing a lot of the dark. So I'm going with Vallejo Game Air Negro Black. And the idea with this is I'm just going to reinforce those extreme darks that I've had, because a big part of the result for these blades is strong value contrast. So strong contrast in light and dark. And the problem is I've lost the dark at the moment. You can see how the effect is kind of there, but it's got no punch to it. And that's because my darks are not strong enough at the moment. So what I'm doing is I'm going to go back in with this black through the airbrush. And between these big green bright highlights, I'm going to try and push the black back into it. Again, I'm being very, very gentle. And I'm trying not to get too much overspray. It's worth noting as well, it doesn't need to be perfect, because actually what happens is when we do the edge highlights later on, those edge highlights will hide a lot of the more questionable areas. So even if you blended these with a brush, the transitions don't need to be perfect, because once you put the edge highlights in and it frames it and brings it all together, it actually hides a lot of the issues. So even if you've got some questionable airbrushing, it will make a massive difference. But as you can see, I've got basically these 4 chunks of black which I've just sprayed on. I'm being very conscious of the angle that I'm holding the blade at. The next thing that I need to do is I need to start putting my edge highlights in place. Now, this is the Moot Green with a little bit of white added to it, straight out of the pot. There's no watery. You can see how that's very stringy. Like, it's very sticky and it doesn't flow back into shape very quickly. We have to break the surface tension. So I've just added some water into this paint. So I break the surface tension on it because I want this paint as opaque as possible while still being as fluid as possible. Because I only want to do an edge highlight once. So you can see how now I've added the water, that paint flows back into shape a lot quicker. So that means that I've broken the surface tension on the paint. This paint consistency is now ideal for the edge highlights that I'm going to do. And what will happen is this paint should give me a very opaque mark. So I should only need to do 1 brush stroke when I do my edge highlight. But it will still be fluid enough so it's not going to tear and it's not going to make a really, really rough mark, which is the last thing that I want. Next up, this is the bit that we don't normally show you because we forget, to be honest with you. You can see how I've loaded my brush up. I've got a lot of paint on this brush at the moment. That paint is too far up the ferrule, it's too far up the brush, so it's oversaturated. So I've just emptied it off. Now I've got more paint and you can see how the paint is only halfway up the brush. So don't overload your brush. And when your brush is loaded, make sure you remove the excess on a piece of kitchen roll. So you can see that the belly of the brush is not overly saturated and you have a nice point on that brush again. So this is really important before you do your edge highlights. When it comes to edge highlights, my personal recommendation is you use the side of the brush wherever you can, because it will give you, even if you don't have a particularly high amount of control, it will give you a fairly nice consistent line. In my experience as well, it's better to use towards the tip of the brush. So you're not using the fat part of the belly. If you use the side of the brush towards the tip, what that means is, first of all, it'll give you a little bit more experience when it comes to managing your brush control, because you've got to be a little bit more careful. But the other thing is, it will automatically make your lines much smaller. If you use the fat belly of the brush, the belly is much wider. It's more chance of you getting a very, very wide line. And that's not what we want at all. So my personal recommendation is if you use towards the side, the tip of the brush at the side, and then that'll hopefully give you a nice consistent mark. And remember, you don't want to be pressing too hard when you're doing an edge highlight, because you'll end up with big thick marks like you can see in that black area in the middle there. What you want to be doing is pressing very gently, and that paint should be coming off very easily. If the paint is not coming off, the paint is too dry on your brush, which means you need to thin it down a little bit more. And if your paint is coming off really easily and it's flowing everywhere, then your paint is too thin. So just be aware of what your paint's doing here. This is really important. So don't overload your brush. Make sure that you unload your brush correctly, so you've got the right amount, so it's not going to flow everywhere and make a massive mess. Make sure that your paint is the right consistency. It should come off easily doing these edge highlights. There shouldn't be any resistance there. When you should just be able to barely touch the model with the side of your brush, and that paint should just come off nice and easily. And as you can see, all we're doing is I'm trying to do every edge at this point. I'm not a big fan of edge highlighting every edge, but for the purpose of this, it's definitely going to be worthwhile. And I am using the bright blue. So I'm using the Cygnus blue highlight with white in it. So I'm very close to white. But again, because I need to fix the saturation later on, that doesn't matter because these are going to get darker. The other thing to bear in mind as well is what you'll notice is I'm moving the model instead of I'm moving my brush. So what that means is if I'm trying to get a nice line, a nice edge highlight on the model, instead of moving my hand around to try and get a better angle, I rotate the model itself. This way I'm not forcing myself into awkward positions, which means I'm going to mess up my brush strokes. So as I do different angled edge highlights, you'll see that I rotate the model as I go. That way there's less chance of making mistakes, which is really, really important, because if you get these fundamental behaviors down, then it's going to cause you less issues in the future. You can see that I've just rotated that around. Now I'm going to do edge highlights on the opposite side of the ones that I've just done. So just think about what you're doing. Remember, we talk about active painting or conscious painting, however you want to think about it, or however you want to describe it. But if you think about what you're doing, you can nearly always make your life a lot easier. So apologies, but I'm going to go for a shameless plug here. If you are enjoying the video, please hit the like button and hit the subscribe button. It makes a huge difference to the channel, which I'm really trying to grow. If you want to join the community, then feel free to check out the Discord. It's completely free and we'd love to see your work in there. If you want to support the channel even further, there is a members area on both Patreon and on YouTube, and the links for those are in the description below. It means a huge, huge amount to me, and I really appreciate everyone's support. But as always, I appreciate not everyone can support at a monetary level. I appreciate that your time. I appreciate the fact that you're sat there watching this at the moment. It means a huge amount to me. So regardless, thank you very much. Now you can see on screen all three blades have got their edge highlights and they've got their color, but they're nowhere near as vibrant as they once were. And some of the edge highlights are a little bit questionable, let's be perfectly honest. They're not as perfect as I'd like them. Granted, I'm on a time frame. Regardless, they could be better. But what I need to start doing is I want to smooth that out. I want to smooth those edge highlights out. And I also want to bring the color back. So what I'm going to start doing, the first thing that I'm using is, these are the scale 75 paints and these are fluorescent paints. So these are fluoro colors. So this particular one is scale 75 speed yellow. And this is just thinned down with water. And all I'm doing is very gently just going over the blade with this yellow. The yellow's really, really weak, so it doesn't have a lot of strength to it. But what it does do is it brings the green out in the blade and really, really makes it pop. So, and I love using fluoro paints for this sort of stuff. I'm not a big fan of huge, massive OSLs personally. Those don't generally do them for me, but fluoro paints can be amazing for making colors much more vibrant. And you can see the difference there. The next one that I'm going to be doing is the purple. So the purple that I'm using is scale 75 fluoro paints. This is psychedelic purple. Now this is quite a soft purple, like it's quite a pinky purple actually, which I don't mind, I quite like. But again, all I'm doing is I'm just couple of coats over it. So we do a coat, make sure you let it dry. Otherwise you're going to end up with nasty spider webs all over the model. Remember, as soon as that paint starts looking wet, stop, let it dry, come back to it. If you want to, use a hairdryer by all means, but you can see the colour coming back into these blades. These fluoro paints are really, really making a big difference to these. And they're really good fun. They're really, really handy. The set itself is not particularly expensive, but there's lots of different fluoro brands. So give them a go. I quite like the Scale 75 ones. The blue that I'm using is same again, Scale 75, electric blue this time though. It's bringing back all of the vibrancy to it. So experiment with it. Fluoro paints can be really, really good for just like reintroducing color. But what it also does, because we're doing really thin layers over this, it's also smoothing out some of the more questionable airbrushing. And it also makes those white edge highlights, those almost white edge highlights, it makes those a nice color again. They're not pure white, they're now just a really bright green or a really bright blue or a really bright purple. Lastly, or one of the last things that we're now going to do is we're going to go back with those edge highlights with that white, and we're going to make the last little edges pop again. So where we've toned down all of the edge highlights that we did, where we did those edge highlights everywhere, now what we're going to do is instead of doing every edge highlight, we're going to do the edges that are facing upwards or facing towards the light. So we're keeping this very, very small. So this is the same color as we did the last edge highlights, but the fluoro paints have made those darker. So now when we go back into it, it's going to make those edge highlights pop again. So we have a gradient in an edge highlight, which is really, really important. It gives some real nice depth to the model. So definitely, definitely worthwhile doing. And you can see as I'm painting all three of these at the same time, obviously not in real life, but as you can see all three of them at the same time, it makes a big, big difference to the end result. Once we've got those last edges in, next up what we're going to do is we're going to try and make the main reflections pop a little bit. So this is the Moot Green with a little bit of white added to it. What we need to do is mix it up to a glazed consistency of paint. Just get it into focus so it actually looks right. There we go. So we want to try and mix it up to a glazed consistency of paint. So what we've got at the moment is something close to a layer. So this is semi-transparent. If we didn't have a lot on our brush, that's not going to cut it at this point. So we're going to add a huge amount of water to this. And we're going to thin it down to the point that it's almost completely see-through. And then we need to make sure that we remove all of the excess from the brush. So you can see how thin that paint is right now. You can barely see the green coming through. I don't want any real hard marks when it comes to this next step. And what we're going to do is you need to make sure that we unload our brush correctly. So when we load our brush up, as you can see, we have loads of liquid in the belly. We can't afford to have that because it's just going to float everywhere. So we've got that super thin paint, drag it along the kitchen roll and twist. You can see the majority is now off of the brush. So the brush is not loaded up very much at all. And the paint is incredibly thin. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do some brush strokes towards our highlight colors, towards our highlight areas, sorry, in the hopes of building up this nice reflection. Now the thing with white is the minute you start adding a lot of white to your paint, it gets very chalky, it's very awkward to work with, and it's quite hard to blend. So there's a couple of ways that you can deal with this. You can just go with thinner paint and even less paint on your brush. I don't particularly like doing that because it takes a huge amount of time and I don't particularly enjoy painting in that way. So for me, what I do is I'll place the white, I'll place that bright color on, and then I'll go back with the previous color, which is what I'm doing now. So in this case, I've gone back with the fluoro paints that I was using with the airbrush, and I'm using it to blend out those marks, that highlight that I placed on. So we go up to the white colors and then we bring it back down with the darker colors because it's easier to blend those colors. Hopefully that makes sense anyway. That way we basically mitigate the challenges that we have with paints that have a lot of white in them. But that's it. I'm hoping this video has been helpful. Let me know what you think in the comments as always. I really appreciate everyone watching. As always, make sure you hit the like button, hit the subscribe if you want to see more, and feel free to check out the members area in the description below. Cheers everyone. Have a great weekend.